The morning air was crisp, carrying with it the faint scent of freshly cut grass and the distant hum of city life. The royal palace stood tall and majestic against the clear blue sky, its grandeur drawing visitors from all corners of the world. Tourists milled about, their laughter and chatter filling the open courtyard as they snapped photos of the iconic guards stationed at their posts. The guards, dressed in striking red tunics and towering bearskin hats, moved with mechanical precision, their stoic expressions unchanging despite the throngs of people watching them. Among the crowd stood Henry Calloway, a man whose presence seemed both ordinary and extraordinary. His silver hair gleamed softly under the sunlight, and his weathered hands gripped a polished wooden cane with quiet determination. Though he blended in with the tourists around him, there was something different about Henry, a quiet dignity that set him apart. He wore a simple jacket over a faded shirt, but pinned to his lapel was a small medal, tarnished with age yet gleaming with significance. It was a piece of his past, a reminder of battles fought and sacrifices made. Henry's eyes scanned the scene before him, taking in the splendor of the palace and the discipline of the guards. To most people, these men were symbols of tradition, standing motionless for hours as part of an ancient ritual. But to Henry, they represented something deeper: service, loyalty, and the unspoken bond shared by those who dedicate themselves to protecting others. As he watched the rhythmic march of boots on stone, memories began to stir within him, pulling him back to a time when his own life had been defined by duty. Decades earlier, Henry had been a young soldier, full of hope and fear, stepping onto foreign soil for the first time. He remembered the camaraderie of his fellow troops, the way they joked to ease the tension before missions. He also remembered the silence that followed, when names were no longer called during roll call, when letters stopped arriving home. Those losses stayed with him, etched into his heart like scars that never fully healed. Now, standing here among strangers, he felt a lump rise in his throat. This place wasn't just a tourist attraction. It was a shrine to the values he still held dear. As the minutes passed, Henry found himself drawn to one particular guard. The young man stood perfectly still, his rifle resting against his shoulder, his face expressionless. There was a kind of grace in his posture, a quiet strength that reminded Henry of the soldiers he'd served alongside. He couldn't help but feel a pang of pride and sadness. Pride because the spirit of service lived on through men like this guard, and sadness because so few people truly understood what it meant to carry that weight. Without realizing it, Henry straightened his back, his grip tightening on his cane. His gaze locked onto the guard, and for a moment, the bustling crowd around him faded away. All that remained was the connection between two souls bound by a shared purpose, separated only by time and circumstance. And then, almost instinctively, Henry raised his hand in a salute, not flashy or exaggerated, but firm and deliberate, a gesture born of respect and gratitude. Little did he know, this simple act would set off a chain of events that would leave everyone around him deeply moved. Henry's salute lingered in the air, a silent bridge between his past and the present moment. As his hand remained raised, memories flooded back like waves crashing against the shore, each one more vivid than the last. He thought of the muddy trenches where he had once crouched, the cold biting at his fingers as he clutched his rifle. He remembered the faces of his comrades, men who had become brothers in the span of a few short weeks. They had laughed together, shared stories of home, and promised to look out for one another no matter what. But promises were fragile things on the battlefield, and too many of those men never made it back. He recalled James "Jimmy" O'Donnell, his closest friend during the war. Jimmy had been the kind of guy who could make anyone smile, even in the darkest moments. His jokes about ration food and his impersonations of their drill sergeant had kept morale high when despair threatened to creep in. One fateful night, under a sky lit by artillery fire, Jimmy had shielded Henry from an explosion with his own body. That sacrifice haunted Henry every day since. He often wondered if Jimmy would have been proud of how he'd lived his life after returning home. or if he'd think Henry hadn't done enough to honor the peace they had fought so hard to protect. Standing there now, years later, Henry felt the weight of those memories pressing down on him. The world had moved on, but the scars of war stayed with him, invisible yet ever present. Sometimes he caught himself staring into the distance, lost in thoughts of battles won and lost. Other times he struggled to sleep, the echoes of gunfire still ringing in his ears. Yet despite everything, he carried on, not because it was easy, but because it was what Jimmy and the others would have wanted. Their sacrifices demanded that he keep going, even when the burden felt unbearable. The guard before him, young and disciplined, seemed worlds away from the chaos Henry had endured. But there was something familiar in the way the young man stood. The same unwavering commitment to duty, the same quiet resolve. It reminded Henry that while wars change, the essence of service remained constant. Men and women continued to step forward, risking everything so others could live without fear. And though society often took their sacrifices for granted, Henry knew better. He understood the cost of freedom, having paid part of it himself. As he held his salute, tears began to well up in his eyes, not out of sadness, but out of gratitude. Gratitude for the men and women who serve today, just as he and Jimmy had served decades ago. Gratitude for the chance to stand here, alive and breathing, in front of this palace that symbolized resilience and unity. And gratitude for the opportunity to acknowledge someone who might not hear "thank you" nearly enough. For Henry, this wasn't just about saluting the guard. It was about bridging generations, connecting his story to the stories of those who came after him. It was about saying, "I see you. I understand your sacrifice, and I'm grateful." With each passing second, the crowd around him grew quieter, sensing that something profound was unfolding. Cameras clicked softly, capturing the elderly man's gesture, but none of that mattered to Henry. All that mattered was the connection he felt in that moment, a thread stretching across time, tying him to the young soldier standing tall before him. The guard, Corporal James Whittaker, was trained to remain impassive no matter what happened around him. His role demanded discipline, focus, and an unwavering commitment to protocol. For hours on end, he stood perfectly still, his gaze fixed ahead, blocking out the chatter of tourists, the clicking of cameras, and even the occasional child waving wildly to get his attention. He had been taught that a royal guard's duty was to project strength and stability, not just for the palace, but for the nation itself. Emotions, distractions, and personal interactions were strictly forbidden. But something about the elderly man's salute broke through James's carefully constructed walls. It wasn't just the crispness of the gesture or the way the man held it with such obvious effort despite his frailty. It was the look in his eyes, a mixture of pride, sorrow, and gratitude, that struck a chord deep within James. In that moment, the young corporal saw beyond the uniform he wore and recognized the humanity they shared. This wasn't just another tourist trying to capture a memory. This was someone who understood sacrifice in ways James could only begin to imagine. James hesitated, his training warring with his instincts. Every fiber of his being screamed to stay still, to maintain the rigid posture expected of him. But as he looked at Henry, he couldn't shake the feeling that ignoring this moment would be wrong, almost disrespectful. The elderly man's salute wasn't just a gesture. It was a bridge between two worlds, a silent acknowledgement of service rendered and lives given. To dismiss it felt like turning away from something sacred. Slowly, deliberately, James made his decision. With precise movements, he lowered his rifle slightly, breaking the rigid stance that defined his position. The crowd gasped audibly, their murmurs rippling through the courtyard like a sudden gust of wind. Cameras clicked furiously, capturing every second of this unexpected deviation from tradition. James ignored them all, focusing solely on the man before him. He brought his hand up in a sharp, respectful salute, mirroring Henry's gesture with equal reverence. Time seemed to slow as the two men locked eyes across the space between them. James felt a surge of emotion he hadn't anticipated. A mix of humility, admiration, and a profound sense of connection. Here was a man who had walked paths James could barely comprehend, carrying burdens far heavier than any rifle. And yet, despite everything, he stood here today, offering gratitude to someone half his age. It was humbling and inspiring, all at once. For James, this moment wasn't just about returning a salute, it was about honoring the legacy of those who had come before him. Men like Henry had paved the way, enduring hardships and making sacrifices that allowed James to stand where he did today. By breaking protocol, James wasn't rejecting his role. He was embracing it in a deeper, more meaningful way. Service wasn't just about standing guard over a palace. It was about recognizing and respecting the sacrifices of others, whether they wore a uniform yesterday or 50 years ago. As the seconds stretched on, James felt a weight lift from his shoulders. For the first time in what felt like forever, he wasn't just a symbol of tradition or authority. He was a person, connected to another person through shared values and mutual respect. The crowd might see this as a breach of rules, but to James, it was something much greater, a reminder of why he chose to serve in the first place. The moment Corporal James Whittaker returned Henry's salute, the atmosphere around them shifted dramatically. The once casual buzz of the crowd turned into a stunned silence, broken only by the occasional gasp or whisper. People who had been snapping photos and chatting animatedly just moments before now froze in place, their eyes glued to the unfolding scene. Some tilted their heads in confusion, unsure if what they were witnessing was real. Others pressed their hands to their mouths, visibly moved by the unexpected exchange. "What's happening?" One woman whispered to her companion, her voice trembling with curiosity and emotion. Her friend shook her head, equally bewildered but unable to look away. Nearby, a father knelt down to explain to his young daughter why the guard wasn't standing still anymore. "That man over there," he said softly, pointing to Henry, "is showing respect to the guard because he used to be a soldier too. And now the guard is saying thank you back." The little girl's eyes widened, and she clutched her father's arm tightly, as though afraid to miss a single second of the moment. Cameras flashed relentlessly, capturing every angle of the interaction. Tourists leaned forward, craning their necks to get a better view, while others held up their phones to record videos. Social media feeds were about to explode with this story, though no one in the crowd knew it yet. At that moment, all that mattered was the raw humanity playing out before them, a rare and unscripted moment of connection in a world often dominated by routine and detachment. Amidst the murmurs, a man in his 30s wiped tears from his eyes. He had served in the military years ago and understood the weight of what was happening. To him, this wasn't just a polite gesture. It was a powerful reminder of the bonds forged through service. A woman standing beside him noticed his reaction and gently touched his shoulder. "Are you okay?" she asked quietly. He nodded, swallowing hard. "It's just beautiful," he managed to say, his voice thick with emotion. She smiled sadly, her own eyes glistening, and gave his arm a reassuring squeeze. Even the other guards, trained to remain stoic and focused, couldn't help but steal glances at James and Henry. Though none of them moved from their posts, there was a subtle shift in their demeanor, a quiet acknowledgement of the significance of the moment. One of them blinked slowly, almost imperceptibly, as if to process what he was seeing. Another tightened his grip on his rifle, not out of tension, but as a silent show of solidarity with his fellow guard. For Henry, the reaction of the crowd only deepened the emotional impact of the moment. He hadn't expected any of this, certainly not the guard returning his salute, and definitely not the wave of attention it sparked. As he stood there, his hand still raised, he felt a warmth spread through him, pushing back against years of loneliness and feeling forgotten. For so long, he carried the weight of his experiences silently, convinced that the world had moved on without him. But here, surrounded by strangers who were clearly moved by his gesture, he realized he wasn't invisible after all. Tears began to stream down his cheeks, unchecked and unashamed. He didn't try to hide them. Instead, He let them flow freely, each drop carrying pieces of grief, pride, and gratitude. The crowd noticed, and their reactions grew even more heartfelt. Some people began to clap softly, tentatively at first, then with growing enthusiasm. It wasn't applause for performance. It was applause for courage, resilience, and the enduring spirit of those who serve. As the sound of clapping filled the air, Henry lowered his hand slowly, his chest rising and falling with the effort of holding back sobs. His gaze never left James, who remained locked in his salute, his expression a mix of reverence and determination. Neither man spoke, but words weren't needed. In that brief, extraordinary moment, they communicated everything that mattered: respect, gratitude, and an unspoken promise to honor the legacy of those who came before them. The clapping from the crowd grew louder, echoing through the courtyard like a heartbeat. It was spontaneous yet deeply felt, each clap a tribute to the bond unfolding between Henry and Corporal James Whittaker. But just when it seemed the moment couldn't become any more profound, James did something that left everyone breathless. Slowly, deliberately, he took a single step forward, not enough to abandon his post, but enough to close some of the distance between him and Henry. The movement was slight, almost imperceptible, but its significance rippled through the gathered onlookers. James lowered his rifle slightly, holding it diagonally across his chest in a gesture of respect. Then, with his free hand, he extended it toward Henry, breaking every rule drilled into him during his training. "Thank you for your service, sir," he said, his voice clear and steady despite the weight of emotion behind it. Those simple words carried centuries of tradition, sacrifice, and shared humanity. They were not just spoken to Henry. They were meant for all those who had served before him, whose names might be forgotten, but whose contributions endured. Henry's breath caught in his throat. His weathered face softened as tears spilled freely down his cheeks. For decades, he had carried the burden of memories no one else could fully understand, losses too heavy to put into words, battles fought long after the war ended. Yet here was this young man, standing tall in his uniform, acknowledging him in a way that made him feel seen and valued again. It wasn't just gratitude, it was validation, a reminder that his sacrifices mattered, even now. With trembling hands, Henry reached out and grasped James's hand firmly. Their handshake was strong yet gentle, a bridge spanning generations. "And thank you for yours," Henry replied, his voice cracking under the weight of emotion. His words were simple, but they carried immense meaning. He wasn't just thanking James. He was expressing gratitude for everyone currently serving, the men and women who stood guard over freedoms he had once fought to protect. In that moment, their connection transcended age, rank, and time. They weren't just two individuals. They represented the continuum of service, resilience, and sacrifice. The crowd erupted into applause once more, this time with even greater intensity. People cheered, some openly sobbing while others hugged strangers beside them. A teenage boy turned to his mother, asking why everyone was crying. She knelt down, her own eyes wet with tears, and explained, "Because sometimes people show us what real courage and kindness look like." The boy nodded solemnly, clutching his phone tighter to capture the moment forever. Tourists began sharing stories among themselves, recounting moments when they or someone they loved had served. An older woman stepped forward, her voice shaking as she told Henry about her late husband, a veteran who would have been proud to witness this exchange. Another man approached cautiously, revealing that he was a retired officer himself, and thanked Henry for reminding him of the importance of honoring the past. Each story added layers to the moment, weaving together a tapestry of shared experiences and emotions. Even the other guards seemed affected, though they remained stoic in their posts. One of them blinked slowly, his jaw tightening ever so slightly, an unspoken sign of solidarity with James. Another tilted his head almost imperceptibly, as if bowing to the gravity of the situation. Though none of them moved from their positions, there was a palpable shift in the air, a collective recognition of the power of what had just occurred. As the applause continued, Henry looked around at the faces surrounding him, young and old, locals and visitors alike, all united by the raw authenticity of the moment. He realized then that this wasn't just about him or James. It was about the stories we carry, the legacies we leave behind, and the connections that remind us we're never truly alone. For the first time in years, Henry felt part of something larger than himself, a community bound together by respect, gratitude, and the enduring spirit of service. The emotional exchange between Henry and Corporal James Whittaker didn't end with their handshake. As they stood there, hands still clasped tightly, the world around them seemed to pause. The clapping from the crowd softened into a hushed murmur, as though everyone instinctively understood that this moment needed space to breathe. Strangers who had been mere spectators moments ago now felt like participants in something profound, their hearts swelling with admiration for both men. James leaned in slightly, his voice low but earnest. "Sir, may I ask where you served?" he asked, his tone respectful and curious. Henry hesitated for a moment, surprised by the question. It wasn't often that anyone asked about his service anymore. Most people saw him as an elderly man, not as someone who had once worn a uniform and faced unimaginable challenges. But James's genuine interest stirred something within him, and he found himself eager to share. "I was in Korea," Henry replied, his voice steady despite the emotions coursing through him. "It was a long time ago." He chuckled softly, the sound tinged with both nostalgia and sadness. "We were kids then, really, just trying to do our part." James nodded solemnly, absorbing every word. "My grandfather served in Korea too," he said, his eyes lighting up with recognition. "He used to tell me stories about the cold, the kind of cold that seeps into your bones and never leaves." Henry's gaze softened at the mention of shared experiences across generations. "That's exactly right," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "And the camaraderie. We relied on each other like family. Lost too many of them along the way, though." His voice trailed off, and for a brief moment, the weight of those memories settled heavily on his shoulders. James noticed the shift immediately and gave Henry's hand another firm squeeze, silently assuring him that he was heard and understood. The connection between them deepened with each passing second. What started as a simple salute had evolved into a heartfelt conversation, bridging decades of history and experience. For James, it was humbling to hear firsthand from someone who had walked the path he now followed. For Henry, it was cathartic to speak openly about his past, knowing that someone younger valued his story. Around them, the crowd continued to watch in awe, their phones lowered as they absorbed the humanity of the moment. A young woman stepped forward timidly, her hands clutching a notebook and pen. "Excuse me, sir," she said, addressing Henry. "Would you mind signing this? I want to remember today forever." Her request broke the spell momentarily, drawing smiles from both men. Henry took the notebook with trembling hands and scrawled his name carefully, adding a small inscription. "To those who serve, thank you." The woman beamed, tears streaming down her face as she hugged the notebook to her chest. Others soon followed, forming a line to express their gratitude. A middle-aged man shook Henry's hand firmly, thanking him for his service and sharing that his father had also been a veteran. A teenage girl shyly handed him a flower she'd been carrying, her cheeks flushed with emotion. Each interaction added another layer to the day's events, transforming what began as a quiet visit to the palace into something extraordinary. As the crowd dispersed slightly, allowing Henry and James some breathing room, the corporal glanced toward his fellow guards. Though protocol dictated returning to strict formality, none of them moved to interrupt. Instead, one of them subtly adjusted his stance, a silent signal of support for James's actions. It was a reminder that while rules mattered, so did compassion and understanding. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, Henry turned back to James, his expression filled with gratitude. "You've done more for me today than you'll ever know," he said quietly. James shook his head, humility etched into his features. "No, sir. "It's the least I could do. Men like you paved the way for all of us." Their words hung in the air, simple yet profound, encapsulating the bond they now shared. For Henry, this encounter wasn't just about being acknowledged. It was about feeling seen, valued, and connected once again. And for James, it was a powerful reminder of why he chose to serve, to honor the sacrifices of those who came before him. Together, they had created a moment that would resonate far beyond the palace walls, touching lives and inspiring countless others to reflect on the true meaning of service and gratitude. By the time Henry and Corporal James Whittaker parted ways, the story of their encounter had already begun to spread like wildfire. Tourists who had witnessed the moment uploaded videos and photos to social media, captioning them with phrases like, "A salute that brought us all to tears," and "This is what respect looks like." Within hours, the post went viral, capturing the attention of thousands, and soon, millions, of people around the world. News outlets picked up the story, airing clips of the interaction and interviewing eyewitnesses who described it as unforgettable and life-changing. For many, the video struck a deep chord. Veterans from different eras watched it repeatedly, seeing themselves in Henry's trembling salute and tear-filled eyes. Active duty service members shared the clip online, expressing pride in James's decision to break protocol in such a meaningful way. Civilians who had never served but appreciated the sacrifices of others were moved to learn more about military history and the enduring legacy of those who protect their nations. The story became a catalyst for conversations about gratitude, duty, and the importance of recognizing the human beings behind the uniforms. Letters poured into the palace by the hundreds, each one carrying messages of thanks and admiration. Some came from veterans sharing their own stories of sacrifice and resilience. One letter, written in shaky handwriting, read, "I haven't talked about my time in Vietnam in years. Seeing this gives me hope that people still care, not just about the wars we fought, but about the lives we lived afterward." Another was from a young soldier currently stationed overseas, thanking James for reminding him why his work matters. "Your salute to that veteran reminded me that even when I feel invisible, there are people out there who see us and honor us," the note said. The impact wasn't limited to individuals. Communities rallied together to celebrate acts of service. Schools organized assemblies where students learned about the significance of saluting and the values it represents: respect, unity, and acknowledgement of shared struggles. Local businesses offered discounts to veterans and active duty personnel as a gesture of appreciation. A grassroots campaign emerged online, encouraging people to share photos or videos of themselves saluting alongside messages of gratitude for those who serve. Hashtags like #ASalutitoHeroes and #Gratitude in Action trended globally, uniting strangers across continents through a common theme of respect. Back at the palace, James faced both praise and scrutiny. His superiors acknowledged the humanity of his actions, but reminded him of the importance of maintaining discipline while on duty. Still, they couldn't deny the overwhelmingly positive response his gesture had sparked. Privately, several senior officers admitted that James had done something remarkable, something that highlighted the heart behind the uniform. Meanwhile, fellow guards began referring to him as the guard who broke the rules to honor a hero, a title he accepted humbly. As for Henry, the attention took some getting used to. Reporters reached out, hoping to interview him, but he declined most requests, preferring to let the moment speak for itself. However, he did agree to write a short reflection for a national newspaper, which resonated deeply with readers. In it, he wrote, "That day, I went to the palace to pay my respects, not expecting anything in return. What I received instead was a reminder that my service mattered, that no matter how much time passes, there will always be someone willing to say thank you. That young corporal reminded me of the power of connection, and for that, I am forever grateful." The ripple effect of the encounter continued to grow. Military museums saw an increase in visitors eager to learn about past conflicts and the men and women who shaped history. Charitable organizations supporting veterans reported record donations, inspired by the renewed focus on honoring service members. Even politicians referenced the story in speeches, urging citizens to come together in moments of unity rather than division. Through it all, Henry and James remained symbols of something greater than themselves, a testament to the enduring bonds forged through service and sacrifice. Their brief meeting at the palace had ignited a movement, proving that small acts of kindness and recognition could create waves of change far beyond what anyone might expect. It was a reminder that even in a fast-paced, often disconnected world, moments of genuine human connection have the power to inspire, heal, and unite. Weeks after the unforgettable encounter at the palace, Henry Calloway received a letter bearing the royal seal. At first glance, he thought it might be a formal acknowledgement of gratitude from the palace administration, a polite gesture to thank him for his service and the attention his salute had brought to the institution. But as he opened the envelope, his hands trembled with surprise and emotion. Inside was an invitation, written in elegant script, asking him to attend a special ceremony at the palace honoring veterans and active duty service members alike. The note ended with a personal request. "We would be honored if you could share your story." Henry read and reread the letter, his heart swelling with pride and disbelief. For years, he had lived quietly, rarely speaking about his time in Korea or the sacrifices he and his comrades had made. Now he was being invited not just to witness a tribute, but to play a central role in it. Though hesitant at first, worrying that he didn't have much to say, he eventually accepted, sensing that this was an opportunity to honor not only himself, but also those who hadn't come home. On the day of the event, Henry arrived at the palace dressed in his finest suit, his faded medal pinned proudly to his lapel. As he walked through the grand halls, escorted by staff members who treated him with reverence, he couldn't help but marvel at how far life had brought him since those muddy trenches. The courtyard where he'd saluted Corporal James Whittaker weeks earlier was now transformed into a vibrant gathering space, filled with dignitaries, military personnel, families, and ordinary citizens eager to pay their respects. When it came time for speeches, Henry was introduced to the crowd by none other than James himself, who stood tall in his ceremonial uniform. "This is the man whose salute reminded us all of what truly matters," James said, his voice steady yet emotional. "He represents courage, sacrifice, and the enduring spirit of those who serve." The audience erupted into applause as Henry slowly rose from his seat, leaning on his cane for support. His steps were slow but deliberate, each one carrying the weight of decades of memories. Standing before the microphone, Henry looked out at the sea of faces, some familiar, most not, and felt a surge of gratitude. He began by thanking James for his kindness that day, calling him a young man who understands the true meaning of respect. Then, in simple, heartfelt words, he shared snippets of his journey, the friendships forged in war, the losses that still haunted him, and the quiet pride he carried despite the scars. "I'm no hero," he said, his voice breaking slightly. "The real heroes are the ones who didn't make it back. All I tried to do is live a life worthy of their sacrifice." His words resonated deeply, bringing tears to countless eyes. When he finished, the room erupted into a standing ovation that lasted several minutes. Strangers approached him afterward, shaking his hand and sharing their own stories of loved ones who had served. Among them was James, who embraced Henry warmly. "You've inspired so many people today, sir," James told him sincerely, "including me." As the evening drew to a close, Henry left the palace surrounded by applause and gratitude. Yet what stayed with him wasn't the accolades. It was the knowledge that his small act of saluting had sparked something far greater. It had reminded the world of the importance of recognizing service, sacrifice, and the humanity behind every uniform. And though his journey had been long and often lonely, he now knew his legacy would endure, not in medals or monuments, but in the hearts of those inspired to carry forward the values he held dear.